Afternoon, it's Wednesday the 29th of April 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thompson, bringing us Eastern approaches from the Netherlands. It goes on, Mike, it goes on. Lockup
goes on, absolutely. So, we did actually manage to update the statistics today, Brian. So 3,149,000 global cases of COVID-19 today, 218,386 deaths, 962,804 recoveries. Now, what's very interesting, I'm going to ask Alex about this in a second, but what's very interesting about that figure is that the only two countries that don't seem to be publishing statistics on recoveries are the UK and the Netherlands. And I'd be interested to see if Alex has any thoughts on why that is. But that leaves 1.9 million global active cases, of which 1.911 are mild and 56,903 are considered serious or critical. So Alex, welcome to the programme. Have you got any indication from Holland why the Netherlands is not publishing recovery statistics yet?
I do, in fact, Mike, because it's been in the mainstream press. Several people have been writing to the main titles, broadsheet and online titles, saying, why are we not seeing numbers of recovered people? Because, of course, the Netherlands, being a continental country, has borders with Germany and Belgium. And in those countries, they are publishing such figures, as are other countries further afield. So the response has been given by the RIVM, which is the Dutch government's scientific advisory body. And they've been quite forthright and have said, we don't collate those statistics because it's not in our interest for us to do so, and it doesn't represent a particular priority. We're trying to contain coronavirus. And they go on to say, also, we're not doing the kind of mass testing that South Korea is doing. And by the way, Luxembourg, just down the road from here, has said it's going to be the first country in the world to test all of its people on a supposedly voluntary basis before opening the lockdown. That's been announced just yesterday. But the Dutch have been quite upfront about that. We're not testing because it's not in our interest as officials. That's not our priority. Usually when Dutch officials have such a line, and it's comparable with air safety and other controversial incidents of recent years, I'm talking about the MH17 investigation there. Usually when the Dutch have such a policy, they are reflecting what is actually policy in Britain as well, but just not spoken about in Britain.
Interesting. You would have thought that there would be some desire for some good news and to tell people about the number of recoveries, but maybe it isn't possible to underpin a particular narrative if you do that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right on that, Mike, and a little bit later we'll be having a look at how the government is getting people to do things. And that directly impacts on whether you give them good news or bad news.
Yes. Okay. Well, yesterday the latest Office for National Statistics numbers came out, and so just have a look at the latest situation, which brings us up to week 16, which I think is the 11th of April. And well, it looks pretty disastrous there, Brian, with the ONS statistics of excess mortality showing that really huge levels of excess mortality for week 16. Now, I think what we're going to do here is we'll put a third line on this, a dotted red line in the middle there, which we're going to call COVID-19 deaths, maybe, because it's really pretty difficult to work out exactly what's going on. I've put this line on with a couple of caveats. First of all, what it says on the Office for National Statistics spreadsheet is deaths could possibly be counted in both causes presented. If a death had an underlying respiratory cause and a mention of COVID-19, then it would appear in both counts. So basically, this is about respiratory disease and COVID-19 disease. And so what I've done is I've removed the respiratory disease numbers from that dotted red line. And the reason that I feel justified to do that is because if you look at the numbers of people that died from respiratory disease from week 1 to week 12, before there were any COVID-19 deaths, it was in the range of 1,500 to 2,500 people per week dying of respiratory disease. And then from weeks 13 to 16, when we did start to see people being labelled as COVID-19 deaths, it's still in the 1,500 to 1,700 range. So those people were people that were going to die anyway, as they had been in every week during the year. So, but the big question about this graph that we've got on screen at the moment is this area here if we accept that those are the numbers of COVID-19 attributed deaths, then that red shaded area there represents probably about 50% of the excess mortality since week 14. And that represents people that have died for reasons other than COVID-19, i.e. the lockdown, whatever you want to call it. Now, what has been the cause of that? Well, because people haven't been getting the routine medical treatments, they haven't been getting their cancer treatment, they've also been dying from heart attacks and strokes. They've been scared to go to hospital because of the narrative that's been played out from the government and from the mainstream press. But indeed, on top of that, we have an increasing number of people tweeting things out like this. My aunt died last week. She had cancer for about 3 months and sadly passed away, but on the death certificate, she died of coronavirus. When my cousin told the doctor that this is nonsense, the doctor replied, "We're just following government guidelines." My cousin was so angry. So we've got quite a number of people talking about this type of thing now. But then I want to draw attention to this article here. This is a German laboratory, and they are saying in this article, which is published on the 23rd of April, that according to World Health Organization recommendations, COVID-19 virus tests are now considered positive even if the specific target sequence of the COVID-19 virus is negative and only the more general coronavirus target sequence is positive. So in other words, if somebody has a common cold, that could give a false positive result because they're not testing for the specific COVID-19 test. So if that's the case, if we've got people being misattributed and we've got the test not being accurate because it's not testing for the correct thing, then if we go back to our graph here, then the question is how many of the dotted line deaths here, the excess mortality, which is attributed to COVID-19, how many of those are actually excess mortality and how many of them are not excess mortality? If we take into account also the fact that the Italian government stated that when they went back and reviewed the situation, only 12% of the people that they had attributed as having died from COVID-19 could actually legitimately be attributed that way, then perhaps the line should look more like this, Brian. And then in that case, it's this red shaded area which is showing the number of deaths as a result of the lockup, as opposed to COVID-19 itself. And I think we've got to keep pushing this point. And the British government has got to start coming up with some answers about the impact of the lockdown itself, as opposed to the disease.
Couldn't agree more, Mike. We know that medical people are on this case and are asking why the British government isn't telling the public the truth over these statistics, why the statistics are being manipulated. And I think what's going to come out is a series of simple questions along these lines, which people need to be putting directly to Cabinet Office ministers, but also, of course, to their local MPs. It's the questions which are so powerful. Get your MP to try and answer, because if they use official statistics, ONS statistics, we are also using those statistics, and therefore we can have an open debate to see who is correct. But at the moment, the inference seems to be that the British government is interfering with statistics in order to deceive the public.
Alex.
This argument that the lockdown itself is causing whatever excess mortality there genuinely is one that has now spread, first of all, to other English-speaking countries. There's been a very shared clip, and suppressed as well, of 2 California emergency room doctors talking about how it was not consistent with common sense to continue to treat the particular virus that we have this year as that much more dangerous that we should lock everyone down. And just in the last couple of days, a very eminent Swiss public health official, Jean-Dominique Michel, that's Michel with no L-E on the end if people want to look it up, spoke to a Swiss website, Fusis, and said that the lockdown was a murderous policy.
Yes, but looking at Ireland here, they have a curious lockdown, as you've labelled it here, because of course the Irish border, the Northern Irish border, was a big issue over Brexit. It's still an issue.
It is a big issue, but what is a really big issue here, it seems, and sorry for those noticing the video lag, there's nothing we can do about that. The really big issue is the competence of the Irish government's health minister, Simon Harris, who became the laughingstock of not just Ireland, but much of the world last week, when he said in a telephone interview with the mainstream press that COVID-19 is unlikely to have a vaccine developed anytime soon because, quote, there's been 18 previous coronaviruses and nobody developed a vaccine for any of them. Well, this time he signed into law. We're seeing this as increasingly what's being done, executive orders rather than going through the Parliament, in this case, the Oireachtas in Dublin. And in this case, Mr. Harris's order looked good to him. And then it was discovered that, of course, since the Republic of Ireland shares a land border with Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, people could try visiting their holiday homes or just visiting the Republic from Northern Ireland. And after a few test cases, An Garda Síochána, the Irish police in the Republic, found that they had no powers to detain people who were not ordinarily resident in Ireland as a republic, as a state. So this is a curious example of not even a territorial order, but one confined to residents. That maybe gives us a peek into what's going on. Popping north of the border, we have a different kind of crisis. Now, Northern Ireland, part of the UK, is one of the many jurisdictions that has seen recent creeping and quite wide-ranging reforms to abortion law, often going under the radar of parliamentary legislation and remaining at the level of ministerial orders. In this case, Brandon Lewis, the Conservative government's Northern Ireland secretary, because many of these powers are still controlled by London because of the political gridlock in Northern Ireland since devolution. Mr. Lewis seems to have acted ultra vires beyond his powers in signing the abortion permission hurriedly into law. But what is concerning is that in the first arguments coming from QCs, senior lawyers, that is, as to why it may have been ultra vires, they're not talking about the Constitution, common law or natural law or inalienable rights. They're saying it may have been incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees safeguards for people if they have questions of conscience in their work.
Right. Okay. And but moving across then to Europe, what's been going on with lockdown over there?
This is the Leids Dagblad, the local paper for the city of Leiden, where the premier Dutch university is. Now, these four posing on the balcony, there's actually 5 of them resident in that student flat, got a heavy fine of several €100 each. It seems that there was a complaint made to Leiden police because they were having, shall we say, some lively student festivities, but it is their own property. And it was a quirk of Dutch law, or again this grey zone of new regulatory territory, that when the police barged in, which they can do with fewer safeguards than normal because of the usual claims, virus crisis, what they did to break up the party and abate the noise was, because they have these powers, the first tool they reached to was to say, you do not form a family, even though you're all registered to this address. You're 5 students. So you're not standing within, outside rather, the 2-meter exclusion zone of each other. You're on the balcony with less than 6 foot space between you. So we're going to fine you all for being in a public place and disregarding the coronavirus social distancing regulations.
But this is a bit ridiculous. I mean, student housing is not renowned for being terribly spacious. And in fact, in the Netherlands in general, it's pretty common for apartments to be pretty small.
Very small and pokey, and for the balcony to be the only place of refuge. And I think the big irony about this actually is that the student apartment in question is on Vrijheidslaan, which means Liberty Lane, and the news was published on the King's birthday, which is the Dutch official national holiday, during which, by the way, the King gave a video toast to the nation in lieu of his normal parade, and said that the heroes of the nation were not just healthcare workers, but, and then he reeled off all kinds of other people, all public servants, you understand. No one who actually generates money for the state is a national hero.
Yes, but in the meantime, in Germany, everybody's required to wear masks.
Except that some are not going along with it. In the southern state of Bavaria, which is more liberty-minded than others, there's a real tangle going on within the governing Christian Union party in the state of Bavaria as to the extent of the lockdown and how to alleviate it now that Germany seems to be coming out of it. The big tussle, as we reported with the Beate Bahner case, is that Mrs. Merkel has set federal orders and the individual states have transposed them in such a swinging way that nobody's allowed to do anything. And that's where the unlawfulness has come in, according to lawyers like Mrs. Bahner. Well, in this case, the Bavarian health minister has, as like a lot of the rest of the Western world, suddenly signed into law below the level of legislation again, ministerial orders, that everyone must wear a mask. And so the sign that the butcher in question has put up in the city of Nuremberg is, "We don't intend to be bit part players in the Bavarian health minister's Punch and Judy show. If you really want to see us with masks on, why not pop back at carnival time? Fearful shoppers and those in risk groups had better just stay at home." So there's the risk back where it belongs, with the individual, so that the fear doesn't paralyse the whole of society.
And is this something that you're seeing in the Netherlands as well, people taking this upon themselves to make these decisions for themselves?
Yes, unfortunately, all over Europe, there's this habit of saying, "What am I allowed to do? Let me look up the rules." The Dutch are more liberty-minded than most, but you're starting to see people taking the initiative of saying, "I'll wear a mask if it allows me to go back to work." In fact, the Scottish Review had a piece just this morning with the same mindset. You know, if the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, then I will wear a mask. And so the drawbacks is apparently not particularly important. That's just that you can't speak to anyone or show emotion or interact. But the so-called benefit is that you are graciously then allowed to shop or work.
Yeah.
So, Alex, quite remarkable. We're seeing the law made up in UK by the police. We're seeing the law made up in Holland, and there's some rebellion there in Germany. That's happening all around COVID. But behind the scenes in UK, we've got other subtle changes going on, and many thanks to the viewer who highlighted this document to us. It's the Adult Court Bench Book. Now, this is guidance for magistrates. I hope a little bit of video. Yes, it started to play. 200 pages of everything. This book is telling you all the magistrates, how they're going to deal with every single item. It goes on and on and on in more detail. And the inference is that you can't think for yourself as a magistrate. You simply have to go into this book and see the guidance. I'm going to stop it there because it goes, as I say, on and on and on in more detail. But let's have a look at some of the things that it's talking about. Now, if you want to go and look at this, you can find it on the government's own website. Just put in Adult Court Bench Book, and up will come this document, and you can download it as a PDF. But what are we interested in? Well, this was one of the early statements, an amendment to page 178, paragraph 119, energy disconnection warrant has been removed. Now, we only had a limited time to see what was important. I have a feeling that this is important because we know that there's a greater movement towards disconnecting people who don't want a smart meter, for example. It goes on, and it's talking about surcharge amounts payable for increased offences, and it also talks about page 126, information on the approach to council tax enforcement, which has been amended. So we've got millions of jobs being lost, the economy's destroyed, people are really suffering, but what is coming out is more draconian laws which are going to be imposed. So this is part of it, and I found this really amazing, really. Utility warrants. Representatives of utility companies may apply to a magistrate's court for warrants of entry to premises to inspect, read a meter, install prepayment meters, and or to disconnect a supply. Well, that's pretty onerous, but have a look at this. A majority are now dealt with in, quote, bulk applications via telephone conference. The applicant will take the oath and outline the details of the applications over the telephone. Magistrates do not see any paperwork, but details are placed on the applications register to create a formal record. This is corruption, Mike. We've got bulk applications, no paperwork, and of course we've been seeing this in relation to council tax.
Absolutely. Council tax, the first council tax bill issued in April every year. By June, the councils know who isn't paying, and so they head off to the magistrates court with a spreadsheet with whatever number of thousand people there are in their particular council area who aren't paying, and they get enforcement orders pushed through en masse, just like this. So it echoes this very clearly.
And I'm just going to recap that for people. Bulk applications, magistrates do not see any documentation. So you're a utility company, you can use the court as the place of business to put somebody under pressure. You don't have to deliver the paperwork in a normal way, only the person who's trying to defend themselves against the attack. Well, let's go on. There are some additional comments in this document. When considering any application, the court must be satisfied that the company or its employees have a right to enter the premises, that access is reasonably required. If entry sought to enforce payment, there has been a demand for payment, the sums owing. So this is all very well, but if you're not actually looking at documentation, of course, this is all built on sand.
Presumption of guilt as well.
Well, exactly. So we've got biased preferential treatment to the utility company, whilst the ordinary man or woman in the street is in a really insidious position. This is not proper law. This is something very, very draconian. And it gets worse because later on in the document, it starts to tell people in the court what language they can use. And this was to do with disabled people. It shouldn't be used as a collective noun. Disability or impairment is not the same thing as an illness. There's comment about mental illness, but it also goes on into other areas along this line. And what I found fascinating is in the middle of this document, we've got the World Health Organization, which is busy telling us what we can and can't do to counteract COVID-19, but apparently it's also now telling us what we can and cannot do within our courts. So I found that particularly interesting, and people need to read this to see how draconian this control of language is. This is part of it. British. Care should be taken to use the term British in an inclusive sense so that it includes all inhabitants and citizens of our multi-ethnic, multicultural society. Exclusionary use of the term as a synonym for white English Christian is unacceptable. So this is controlling the language, and you control people's thoughts and behaviours. Before I just end with another slide, Alex, this is immensely dangerous stuff. You're doing some work with the law at the moment. We've clearly got major change to our constitution and common law just happening out of sight of the public.
Yes, and although it's happening at the sub-national parliamentary level, for example, through court regulations or ministerial decrees or health board regulations, the buck always stops in a monarchy with the crown and in a republic with the president, because crowns and presidents are on their oath to the people, in our case, the Queen's coronation oath. And of course, royal assent provided to each bill is another area we can look at, because for nearly 200 years now, that's been a sham. The monarch has not provided that assent in person. So we have people, as it were, stripping the carcass of the monarchy and public service and wearing its, as it's said these days, wearing its carcass as a skin suit while demanding respect. If people do come up with this document, the Adult Court Bench Book, which of course applies to England and Wales, not to the whole of the UK, although similar things are happening in Scotland and Northern Ireland, I would direct them to page 142 and 143, which I think you're about to talk about. But they're summing up there what a judge should say these days to a jury about finding guilty or not guilty. Of course, in Scotland, you can also find the case not proven, which is a much better option. And in that list, it still says the burden of proof rests with the prosecution, and the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt, although that's being chipped away at. And it's only occasionally that the burden of proof is reversed and rests with the defendant. Now, how that squares with this Northampton call centre that people have started to get wind of in the case of warrants, we don't know.
Alex, thank you for that. I didn't actually have more on that bench document. Am I correct in there? Did you say that beyond reasonable doubt was used in that document?
Yes, if you look at page 142 of the document, you will find that the bullet point, the third one down the page, which is about to be reported on in your next slide, is that judges are being told the burden of proof rests with the prosecution and the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt, end of bold type. And then the blurb in standard type is, this means that you, this is the judge speaking to the jury, this means that you have to be satisfied so that you are sure that the accused is guilty. If you are not sure, you will find the accused not guilty. And elsewhere in this document, the suggestion is that beyond reasonable doubt should be dumbed down in some way because an average juror can't understand it now.
Right, thank you for that, because that is the beg your pardon, sorry, that is the connectivity with this slide where we've got the Times with that headline. Judges are being told that they can't use beyond reasonable doubt because juries basically are not bright enough to understand what those words mean, and the juries have got to be told they're satisfied that they are sure. So this is more hypnotic language by the government, because it is basically putting in our minds that even as an adult we really can't grasp these very difficult concepts, and we are children.
Well, staying with the law, then lots and lots of people forwarding Ben Fellowes' most recent video entitled COVID-19 Control of Disease Act 1984. Now, there's some things that are correct in this video and a few things that aren't. One of the first things that he says about it is that that this legislation has changed in some way recently. Well, here is the legislation, Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984, and we can see that there have been a number of amendments in the recent past. So it has changed, but his key point, he was focusing mainly on Section 45G, and well, that hasn't actually changed at all. In fact, it is identical to when the Act was originally enacted. But one thing that is of interest, I think, in the light of what Brian has just been showing there, because this particular clause is talking about orders which are made by magistrates, by justices of the peace. And of course, as we've just pointed out, these orders don't have to be made on an individual basis. They could be made as block orders. Nonetheless, what this the key point about the legislation having been changed and that there being something new about this isn't correct, because the only change to this, the amendment, is C22, which is where the Coronavirus Act 2020, which was passed just a few weeks ago, does amend a piece of one single clause in this act. And that's the only change that's been. The rest of it has been more or less there as it was since 1984. Now, Ben suggested in his presentation that there was that this act provided for mandatory medication, including vaccination. And I think that's probably a step too far. There's nothing in this legislation that I can find which, in fact, makes that possible. In fact, there's one clause, Section 45E, which specifically says regulations under 45B or 45C may not include provision for requiring a person to undergo medical treatment. Medical treatment includes vaccination and other prophylactic treatment. So at least one section of this that is specifically excluded. There's nothing that I can see in this which specifically enables mandatory vaccination, but the thing that or the article that Ben was basing this whole thing from was this one from the British Journal of Medical Practitioners. The right to consent, is it absolute? And this was this is the key text that he was highlighting. In order to protect the public from contagious infectious diseases, the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984 regulates notification of diseases and mandatory treatment of conditions like tuberculosis. The individual's right to consent is severely restricted in two areas. Firstly, information about the patient's diagnosis has to be given to the relevant authorities. The patient should be informed about this step. Section 11 regulates the disclosure of information. It is mandatory for a medical practitioner to disclose personal details of the patient and the diagnosis to the relevant authorities, even if the patient does not agree to this. The list of notifiable diseases ranges from food poisoning and viral hepatitis to tuberculosis, and it does now include, in fact, COVID-19. But the article goes on to say, secondly, patients suffering from communicable diseases can be forced to take their medication by supervised administration or involuntary inpatient treatment. Sections 37 and 38 of the Public Health Control of Disease Act have recently been used to detain a man for inpatient treatment of TB against his will at North Manchester General Hospital. The Act was used to prevent the spread of TB to the wider public by forcing treatment onto an individual who was not compliant. But when we go and look at sections 37 and 38, you can read these for yourself, Actually, there's nothing in those that absolutely, those sections do absolutely say that somebody can be detained against their will, taken to a hospital and so on, but there's nothing which specifically allows for mandatory medication as such. So I think there's more work to be done on this, Brian. But you know, I think it was absolutely right. I think Ben did a good job by highlighting this legislation in the first place. I think it's absolutely right that people start actually asking questions about what this does allow and what consent means today in these days. But you know, I'm slightly worried that, you know, people will say, well, this has been legislation since 1984, so we don't need to worry about it. Actually, we do need to worry about it. We need to understand what this legislation means, and we need to be asking our members of Parliament for comment.
And we get a sense of where it's going, because of course we're already seeing serious decisions can be made with just one doctor's signature, which of course is a risk. At this point, we just bring in some comment we've had from one of our viewers. A lot of people are picking up on the language being used by the government in talks to the public, media delivery, but also articles published in the media. And they're saying that the language is being very cleverly crafted in order to get over the meaning that the government wants. And we're well aware, of course, that Boris Johnson and his cabinet heavily reliant on information from the Behavioural Insights team. This is the lot of so-called psychological gurus and boffins who are using applied behavioural psychology to get us to do what the government wants without us even knowing it. So let's have a look at comments that have come in from this viewer. They wanted to remain anonymous, and we respect that. I can also say that they're well qualified in the training that they've had. Let's have a look. It would be difficult to find any statement by any politician, public figure or royalty that is not using NLP, hypnotic, authoritarian, no matter how nicely spoken language, and non-verbal techniques. The meaning of the communication is the response you want to get. We can fight this COVID together is given as an example, and it presupposes COVID is there and that we want to fight it. And the comment is it's always stated in positives. Tony Blair and New Labour identified as the NLP party. We understand this because we know that Tony Blair and his team put a lot of effort into getting this behavioural psychology started. The first rule of hypnosis is repetition, repetition, repetition. Then create a yes set. You understand? Yes. This is important. Yes. The third yes is pretty much a given. And the moment that yes comes, you as an individual are under the hypnosis of where the government, for example, wants to take you. The whole use of the noun COVID and the ensuing debates presupposes that it exists, and the same with the presupposed symptoms. As long as we all debate them, then the psychological effects take place. It's not about true or false, it's about the response behaviour. Are the political systems trying to influence us? Yes. You'd be stupid to think that's not the case. The evidence is in the behaviour you partake in against your will and better judgment unwittingly. All language is hypnotic by nature. Conscious application of that fact evidences the user's intention. NLP hypnosis will not go away. The public needs to become more aware of the language with which they've been indoctrinated and who is exerting this pernicious control. And at that point, I'm going to once again put up this very important government document called Mindspace. All you have to do is search online for mindspace.pdf, and you can read the British government boasting that it can change your views and values and behaviour by using applied behavioural psychology. We'll end that segment by saying that, of course, the British government was working alongside French applied psychology teams, of which key people were from Sarkozy's personal staff, one gentleman, Oliver Willier, and they were looking at how psychology could be used in both UK and France to change the way people behaved. So we've got lock-up. That's been achieved without a whimper because of course people have been terrified. They are fearful of the virus. That is the line that's been spread. And when people are fearful, they're even more vulnerable to the hypnotic suggestion. Well, let's follow it along. Where are we going? We had lock-up first of all. The in phrase is now contact tracing. On the left is a tweet, but it shows a documentary from Australia with what's happening about the use of applications. The Australian government very excited because nearly 2 million Australians have been silly enough to sign up to this government tracking system.
So they're a few weeks ahead of us on that one?
They're a few weeks ahead, yeah. But here's Jeremy Hunt from a few days ago, and he says that he's been pressing for concrete action on contact tracing. Notice this phrase, which is now going to be drilled into people's heads. We've had lockdown, which is really lock up, but now we're going to have contact tracing. And this was his tweet. I've been pressing for concrete action on contact tracing, but today Matt Hancock has delivered. With 18,000 people being recruited alongside widespread testing, we have a clear exit route from the current lockdown, and our approach comes much closer to global best practice. Well, what is the global best practice? That, of course, is the doctrine of Bill Gates, Google, the World Health Organization, and profits from big pharma. But we can see where this is going, which is the government wants us to consent to being tracked and watched by downloading that application ourselves.
Absolutely. We'll just say on that the UK government's approach to this is going to be somewhat different. Many people waiting for Google and Apple to implement their contact tracing facilities on their mobile phones, which then applications will be able to tap into. The UK government, the NHS, saying that they will not make use of what Apple and Google are doing. They want direct communication between their app and a centralized server. So there may be some data protection issues there that people would want to be thinking about. And the question is exactly what data will they be collecting and sending off to
as much as possible.
I would have thought so. Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, you'd like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community. There are options to help us out there. Brian, there was a slight mistake on Monday's programme with the name of the Italian
lady who was reporting to the House of Deputies about the contents of vaccines. Her name was Loretta Bolgan. That's Bolgan. Apologies for that. That was the information that we received from the transcript. The correct name is Loretta Bolgan. I have replied to several people who've asked where they could find the original video, so that's been pushed out. Next week we'll be back on this subject, and we'll give you more details about the amazing things that this lady has identified in vaccines.
Quick reminder that AV11 live stream availability, you can get that through the UK Column website. The URL is on the screen there. Do watch that if you possibly can.
Yep, and you can tune in there by going to the AV11 website and getting a ticket from that address. An amazing lineup of speakers, and of course the backdrop of the world in lockup is going to make it an extremely interesting event. Well, let's move on with having a look at how events are playing on the minds of so-called mainstream journalists. And this is an article sent to us from the Scottish Herald. The journalist is Neil Mackay. Scotland's handling of schools in lockdown is a national disgrace. This is one of the paragraphs where he says, it seems, however, that the Scottish Government, councils and some parents are failing when it comes to the duty of care society must take to ensure our children get a decent education during this time of pandemic. What he's referring to is that, of course, classrooms are being done over the internet, and he praises teachers for doing their job, being ready to help continue the education of children while they're at home, but this being done over the internet. But shock, horror, some of the children are not present in front of those computers. And where does that go to? Well, let's bring in the next bit. Teachers told me that what needs to be done is this: during lockdown, the class register should be used by local and central government for monitoring attendance just as in normal times. If a child is absent from virtual lessons without reason or repeatedly, then call in the virtual truancy officer. Children cannot be left to stagnate educationally during lockdown. Now, I found this amazingly spooky that a journalist would be inviting the government to come into your home to this extent. I had a look at who he was, and when I pressed the link to see his profile on the Scottish Herald site, I came up with this rather weird blank space. But this is what he's talking about. He's suggesting that it's great to get the state directly into the home with powers of fines or imprisonment for repeated offences, because that's what's actually behind this. The Scottish Herald is struggling a bit itself because they say, please pay us, otherwise we're going to go out of business. This is the gentleman. I did find him, and he's getting an award here. And then I found something extraordinary. I found he'd written this article a while ago: Neil Mackay, Fake News, Hate and Propaganda, How We Brought It All on Ourselves. And I'm going to encourage people to read it, because what he says is very accurate. He's talking about the fact that we have all agreed to have our private data hoovered up by the big corporations, and now it's being used against us. And he said at the end of the article, we could and should go much further though. Is my data not my property? If so, pay me for it. It should be a legal requirement for every digital company to consider me opted out of any exploitation of my personal data unless I say otherwise. And if I do approve the exploitation of my data, there should be an agreed price and an absolute right of oversight by any member of the public to discover what's being done with their data. Democracy depends on it. And yet this man has got such cognitive dissonance. He wants to bring the government into people's homes in order to make sure that children are sat in front of computer screens. Alex, just as a quick comment, this is the reality. We're now seeing what is effectively the psychological breakdown of people because they can't grasp the contrasts that are being thrown at them. I just found this man's reporting extraordinary.
If we take the key phrase there, Brian, then very quickly, it's duty of care. Now, that's gone into his psyche because he's a journalist reporting on cases being taken against public bodies. The concept of the duty of care has become fossilized in people's minds. It's a very recent vintage as a term, and it's always used in administrative law, that is the branch of law dealing with how an authority, a public authority like a council or the police, deal with you in a specific situation in which they have you in their care or custody. It's taken a long time to establish that as a principle of government, and no sooner has it been established, and in some constitutions it's been codified as well in administrative law, then what people do, they run away with the term and say we all have a duty of care to all of us. Well, you have to flip that around and say if all of us have a general duty of care to all of us, then none of us has a specific duty to anyone in particular. It's generalized beyond any useful frame of reference. And as soon as you start bandying around a term like duty of care, that's when the cognitive dissonance comes in, because it sounds so bland and positive. Who could possibly be against it? But there's hundreds of years of people fighting for liberties behind that statement.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, let's move on to this. And once again, the article that we published on the UK Column website, the British military information war waged on their own population. I really would like to encourage as many people to share this as possible, because this really gives a bit of the background to where we are with the whole counter-disinformation situation, but also this idea of the fusion doctrine, which is really, really important. Now, this, of course, we covered this issue of 77 Brigade, the fact that they now have 4,000, up to 4,000 people actively dealing with so-called disinformation on the internet with respect to COVID-19, and up to 20,000 people sitting in reserve. Well, last week, Oliver Dowden, who's the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, was giving evidence to the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Of course, he was doing it remotely, and he had this to say.
But the point of stepping up the counter-disinformation unit it's a call we took as a government. So because traditionally, I say tradition, it's only been for the past few years, the disinformation cell has been used in respect of democratic events in order to analyze and counter the threat of hostile state interference in democratic events. But we took the view that in respect of this unprecedented public health crisis and the risk of misinformation, we should step it up in respect of this crisis.
So, Alex, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because what he's saying quite clearly there is that up until now, the counter-disinformation teams run by Andy Price through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and then more recently in the Cabinet Office with the Rapid Response Unit, have been looking outside the UK at well, they've been naming Russia specifically, this Involved Integrity Initiative and all this kind of thing. They have now shifted the focus of this counter-disinformation effort from externally to internally. And this again reinforces this notion that what's happening is that the British government is effectively running an information war on its own people. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that whole situation.
Well, the earliest reference I have dug up on it, together with David Ellis, is a 1976, if I've got the date right, book, the memoirs of one of the key Enigma code crackers, Gordon Welchman, in a chapter that was suppressed out of the reprint of the book later. And in that chapter that was suppressed, he said that he had been called out of semi-retirement by one of the very big US-based but international intelligence computer outfits, the MITRE Corporation, because, as he hinted, the public in the home country was now the enemy. Then that was kind of suppressed for a long time. Now it comes back. A couple of slides later, we will see that the US military and NATO in general are talking about it, as well as the British military and the British health system and the DCMS ministry and committee of parliament as well that you played. This is extremely similar to the video evidence given by from home or from the office, I think, by the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace last week to the Defence Committee of the House of Commons, in which he likewise talked about the role of the military basically being information management in the so-called coronavirus crisis. So there's something very, very coordinated about this now. It's not residing in one country. It's been going on for decades. And I think Oliver Dowden let slip there that it has gone beyond the bounds of democratic debate, which by definition must mean we've got into something post-democratic.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to this. This is a document published by RAND Europe called The Utility of Public Force and Public Understanding in Today's Britain. This was commissioned by the Ministry of Defence, by the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre at the Ministry of Defence. It's been written by Sir Hugh Strachan, who's from the School of International Relations at St Andrews University, but he is also the Chief of the Defence Staff Strategic Advisory Panel. He serves on that panel and on the Defence Academy Advisory Board, and he's a specialist advisor to the Joint Parliamentary Committee on National Security Strategy. It was also written by Ruth Harris, who's served in the armed forces working on global security issues across Africa, Middle East, missions with the UN, NATO and African Union and so on. So this is who's written it. And I just wanted to run through their findings briefly. So hybrid war targets the role of popular opinion in shaping national strategy. They're absolutely encouraging the use of this. Social resilience, this is a term which we're finding absolutely part of the whole COVID-19 narrative, receiving increasing attention in relation to national security, they say. And the effect of ignoring domestic resilience is to undermine deterrence. And they make some recommendations. So emphasising the shared responsibility of resilience, there's that word again, developing a UK concept of deterrence, creating coherence in communications, connecting the armed forces and the government. So this is the fusion doctrine once again, engendering clarity and transparency regarding the wars Britain can fight. Now, what kinds of wars can Britain fight? Well, actually, RUSI recently published a report which says that the wars that Britain should be fighting are proxy wars, and they used Syria as a perfect example of that, where Britain and the United States funded the so-called rebels. We might call them terrorists. So this idea that Britain can fight proxy wars and hybrid wars is something that's absolutely being promoted here. And finally, being open to debate on national service. Now, the question has been asked, what is going to be done with all this excess labour, which is being created by the COVID-19 crisis and the lockup? Lots of people losing their jobs. What's going to be done with it? Is it going to be brought into national service? If it is national service, what kind of national service are we going to find people running? Hybrid warfare operations? Are they going to be running counter disinformation programs? This is a very good question. So we'll end on this because Lucy Fisher from the Times highlighted this thing, and she said that this report has found its way into number 10 and will feed into the delayed integrated review on foreign policy, defence and security, she's told. So, Alex, have you got any thoughts on this, and what direction is this country heading in?
Just thinking on my feet, because we're in borrowed time already, what I'm seeing here is that the Anglo-Saxon countries have got a particular constellation emerging from this. They've got a population, a huge proportion of whom has gone to universities, so-called, mostly fake universities, or very recent ones, that were previously very good technical colleges and then had all their methods and equipment smashed in order to force them into the university straitjacket. People graduating with fluency of a certain kind of postmodern English, which is what the world needs because English is the global lingua franca. What I'm seeing here is that the role for graduates of a certain mindset from Anglo-American universities is going to be to manage to shape the language and the underlying mindset and perception, as David Icke would call it, for the European continent, so that those lesser nations, as this scheme would see it, then get their boots on and fight wars for us.
Yeah, and that brings us very nicely back to the subject of the powerful effect of the use of hypnotic language, and that brings us full circle to the creation of the Behavioural Insights team, which the British government did, and then it unleashed their techniques internally on people working in DEFRA in a £34 million project many years ago. So a lot more to be said on this, but we, the British public, are under attack by our own government that is using applied behavioural psychology to get us to follow along its agenda, and it's taking us in a very dangerous route if we're now seeing the idea of conscription to fight proxy wars.
Alex, we'll just end with these last two stories here. First of all, Ukraine, and our old friend Mikhail Saakashvili. Is he really attempting to get back into the Ukraine?
Yes, in fact, he's been allowed back because the current president on the right there, Mr. Zelensky, has for, I think, the third time rescinded the revocation and given him back his acquired Ukrainian citizenship, so that this disgraced former Georgian president, wanted in Georgia for corruption and various nasty allegations, is now once again no longer stateless, but he's got his Ukrainian citizenship. President Zelensky not only says that he wants to make Mr. Saakashvili his deputy prime minister, which today Interfax Ukraine is reporting that the ruling party will vote for in the National Rada, the parliament, so it's probably a foregone conclusion. But also he's saying that he's very confident that the Donbass war with the separatist regions in the east of the country are going to be resolved under his tenure. So an odd situation, and as always, the key question for the analytical mind is, how did these men get their appointments? Because there has to be someone telling both Saakashvili, you will get yourself elected Georgian president, you will then go to Ukraine and get yourself Odessa, the governorship, and then the prime ministership. And on the other hand, there has to be someone telling Zelensky or whoever is in power before him at the relevant time to do likewise. So, again, it's the Sorosification of Eastern Europe. The only explanation for that is that these men obey orders from the same figure. And at the risk of sounding like a dumb level conspiracy theorist, I'm going to say it is Mr. Soros. At least that's the visible part of it.
Well, that's certainly Saakashvili's history.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A Soros man through and through, who went around starting wars and disagreements for the sake of the Soros agenda. Now, what is the international protection racket known as NATO doing? It's fighting a coronavirus war in a different manner. Stars and Stripes, which is going through hard times now because the Pentagon is trying to limit its access. It's kind of very senior and serious but independent military reporting outlet. It's finding itself disfavored now in favor of more or less in-house titles like the Army Times. But Stars and Stripes is reporting that the coronavirus pandemic is leading to a split in the disinformation. So a spike, sorry, in the disinformation directed at the US and NATO in Europe, and the quotation I've put at the bottom there has none less than SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, saying that there are malign people on the internet. So that slots into what we were saying a moment ago. And on the right, we see that there's someone saying basically "or shucks" in the Defence One outlet, which is kind of a think tank flavoured outlet. And the young lady writing this says that it's such a shame coronavirus has hit now, because military mobility was such a priority and Europe was getting very good at it, and all of a sudden the lockdown comes. But she says there's still all to play for, this lady who works for the Atlantic Council, NATO's think tank, because this year national governments can still reverse all their decisions and put all their money into military mobility, which is getting tanks up to the Russian front, of course.
Yes. Okay, well, I think we should leave it there.
I think we should. Well, we'll say to all our viewers and listeners, very serious times in UK, but of course worldwide. How can we fight this? We need to get the truth out, and that requires good research, getting facts and data onto the table and asking the questions, because it's the questions that do the damage. So don't sit at home feeling hemmed in, locked up. Get working, get pushing the information out. And if the government's got thousands of people spying on us each second of the day, well, let them do it. That's it from us. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
All right.